So, shall we talk about the news about Helen Pluckrose?
Oh, yes. Well, I'm not keen to sort of point out what I'm right. I'm very humble like that. Now, the backstory of this, if I can go back another step, is that a trans-identified male person said that they wanted to hear Helen Pluckrose's version, connection between woke and radical feminism. And she wrote this nonsensical rubbish. She wrote this thread. I don't know whether she'd had it prepared in a top drawer or not. But it was nonsense. And
Yeah.
then it was so buried in a thread that someone must have sent it to Stella O'Malley because she wouldn't have just come across it. She wasn't tagged in it or anything. And then all of a sudden, Stella O'Malley liked the whole thread. And it was so toxic and so terrible that I retweeted it and said, this is what Stella O'Malley is liking. How I felt that was really bad because I thought that Jen Speck was going to lean into political theory that was not only anti-feminist, but really very bad. It doesn't have any logical structure
Mhm.
to it. I found out particularly that she doesn't understand liberalism very well, the political theory of liberalism, that she's going for a liberal aesthetic again.
Yeah.
Anyways, I got smacked for policing likes, but today, and then I wrote in my blog that I thought Jen Speck needed a political advisor and that advisor should not be um, Helen Pluckrose. Today, we find out that Jen Speck have indeed appointed a political advisor and that political advisor was Helen Pluckrose. Now, I don't
I
like
think
that soldier, so
I think technically they've appointed her to the advisory board and
mm,
noting that she is a political and cultural writer and commentator
that's right. Mm,
uh, who opposes ideological capture in vital institutions. I haven't seen evidence of that, to be
no,
honest.
no.
Um, Now, she was involved in the Grievance Studies affair, which was
Mm,
something that launched the careers of herself, James Lindsay, and Peter Boghossian.
yes.
Of the three, I think Peter Boghossian is pretty ace, actually. He's just
He's
seems
the
like
brains of the operation, one would think.
one assumes, yeah.
Mm. I couldn't quite figure. I followed her for ages, years ago. And when she finally put a tweet out, I'll put that up on the screen as well, saying that women were not oppressed, that she didn't think women were oppressed. I said in that thread, I met my friend Julio, and he said, you know what, she's just a very average thinker. And everything just fell into place for me. I thought, of course, because I was trying to figure out that her theory might have been cryptic. I thought maybe she was a bit too, a bit high thinking for me, that maybe I wasn't, that I needed to do a bit more study to understand. I read the book. I thought it was
Mm.
average, is my opinion. But then I realized, no, she's not all that.
I listened to the book on audiobooks,
Yeah.
and so I'm not sure I've given it a really fair run.
Hmm.
Because when you're listening to something, you sort of your attention can be taken by something else. I was listening
Yeah.
to it in the car when I was driving quite a bit. Um, Now we're talking about cynical theories here, obviously, the
Hmm.
book that she wrote with James Lindsay. But what sort of strikes me is that here's this book that's all about, now it is all about supposedly how critical theory, Marxism created critical theory, created all of the queer theories and everything that's corrupted and infected the institutions the
Yeah.
last 30 years,
Yeah.
and which has given rise to like gender identity and everything.
It's a
Now,
very simple synopsis.
it was really simple, but I would have, thinking back on it, I would have expected there to be a fairly in-depth look at the lesbian BDSM scene in the 1970s and 80s, which is
Okay.
absolutely where Gail Rubin
Oh,
came out of, who wrote Thinking Sex, like the foundational document of queer theory, right? It's odd that she would write this whole book about the genesis of what's ultimately, culminated in queer theory without talking about um, queer sex, the queer sex culture, and without talking about sexology and psychiatry and the medical establishment and the massive contribution that those fields made towards, promoting the transgenderism.
They failed ultimately to make a connection between the theories themselves and how they became useful and why they were used and how they got picked up by capital and by government and how the universities become policy centres for government. None of that was talked about. It was as if the theories were thought and they just leaked. I kept waiting for her to give a proper analysis of feminism, but all she ever did was connect the feminist action to a kind of liberalism. They were developing a liberal aesthetic, a liberal theory, a liberal philosophy. That was the great flaw in it, was to me that they kept talking about political theorists as if they were philosophers, and they weren't. People like John Stuart Mill, people like Marx, they were developing theories that they wanted to see applied political theory, and that's what's happened. We've applied them. So they sort of sat in the philosophical realm, and I find that's her problem all around. She continues to stay in that philosophy realm. And when I had that argument with her about liberalism, and I said, you don't understand, said something about that the purpose of liberalism was to save the individual from the tyranny of government. And she said, no, it's a tyranny of the majority. And that is a concept in John Stuart Mill, but that concept is what civil rights, minority protections comes from. And so when I said, well, that's actually the tyranny of the majority, the technology we have to deal with that is minority protections, because we define, it's very difficult to save people from social tyranny without actually giving the government too much power. So this is what we've got. And she pretended that I was bringing up irrelevant things and got all confused, and she was all confused and she blocked me because she couldn't make that step from, because she was trying to make out that the women who were protesting to GenSpec and to Stella O'Malley were enacting a kind of social tyranny, that they were tyrannizing the GenSpec and trans-identified individuals, and they were going to cause them harm. It's the same reference that we get from trans activists, that we are, by denying their identity, we're enacting a kind of social tyranny, which is a danger of giving minority protections to gender identity, which is our key argument. Our key argument is that we don't think gender identity is real, and that we don't think, and the way that they've given the minority protections has undermined women's rights. This is not just a small little aspect of our movement. This is really key political doctrine that is right at the centre. So if my perspective was that if GenSpec are taking this perspective, are moving away from the theory that Helen Pluckrose has gives no ability for women's rights. It gives no political structure for women's rights, because once you deny women's oppression, you can't give them minority protections. We can't have them because there's no basis for them. So that was my concern. If GenSpec deny minority protection to women, then they're not used to anyone. They're of no use to us as feminists. So that was my concern.
Yeah, I think there was that tweet sort of caused a furor a few weeks ago, and in it she sort of makes this accusation that radical feminists can't make an analysis because they only see the root, right?
You thought it
It's
was
like
really smart too.
it's like
You could tell she's
now
thought it up in her lounge room. Sorry.
it's it's utter nonsense, right? Firstly, yeah, there's no arguing with it. Like it's an utter nonsense thing to have argued. And
She
it's
said the
it's sort
root
of,
is patriarchy, but she didn't outline the radical feminist belief that gender was a system of hierarchy, social hierarchy and oppression.
well, no. And um so she doesn't understand feminism. She doesn't understand radical feminism.
No.
And
Or
she's
liberalism, I might
or
say.
liberalism. and and I've been musing. Oh, I'll tell one thing. Genevieve Gluck, uh, I saw a tweet from her today in response to James Lindsay had put out a quote. He'd put out a video of Germaine Greer saying gender is all culture. And
Yeah,
then Genevieve Gluck says, no, look at the entire, you know, 60-second quote where Germaine Greer says, gender is culture and it is unreal, and sex is material and sex is real, and you
real.
can't choose your sex.
That's
And
right.
it was so emblematic
Mm.
of the style of both Lindsay and Pluckrose, where
Yeah.
they imagine what they want you to have said, and then they argue against that. And
It's
Lindsay
classic
is
straw man, yeah?
it's a classic straw man, yeah. It
Yeah.
and you end up sort of having this conversation, and you think, well, who are you talking to?
Yeah, that's
Um,
right.
like, is there someone that I can't see in this conversation?
Yeah. And they'll bring up all the lib fem stuff. And actually, when I talked to um, Helen Pluckrose, her arguments were lib fem.
Yeah, she's very lib fem.
Her
And
perspectives were,
she's very pro-trans, and she's very lib
that's right.
fem, and she
Yeah.
absolutely doesn't believe that there's any. And I'm the last person who is going to sit there and say women need to identify with an oppressed persona, and
Yeah.
that in order to be women we need to be oppressed. I think that that is crap. Um, and I don't think it serves us as women.
No.
I know I have a pretty good life.
Yeah.
There's very few instances where being a woman impacts me negatively. Having babies,
But we
that kind of
stand on
stuff.
the work of our mothers and our grandmothers. We stand on the work of feminists.
Exactly. My grandmother had a job in a factory when her husband was at war, and when he came back, when all the men came back, they said, "All right, love, off you go.
Go back to the kitchen.
Back to the kitchen now."
Mm,
Okay. So, and she, to her credit, she said, "No, I'm staying.
that's right. Yeah.
I'm staying at work because I want an income. I want a wage."
To be fair,
Um,
that's also, I don't want to misrepresent the radical feminist viewpoint, although I don't agree with it, and I've said that. I that their view is that women are structurally oppressed, and
mm,
that is true. Women
yeah.
in the natural state, not the natural state, I'm not talking about Adam and Eve, I'm not talking about how things should be or ought to be or anything like that, but the way that human reproductive roles are is that women become vulnerable, particularly in a post-industrial society, on males, particularly in societies where males were earning more, because they are the sex who reproduce. So there are structural inequities. They're not inequities, they're structural disadvantages that women face, structural vulnerabilities. And they consider that gender is a system that is imposed on society where women are given messages to that when they believe them and when they act out the gender roles, it's a system of oppression. And if you
Mm,
study almost any society in history, that would be difficult to argue against. But I think the liberal argument that I thought that Helen was going to make when I read that book and that she didn't, um, is that we've managed to use the state to mitigate those issues. We've managed to use the state to say, no, you're not, and political power and collective political power to insist that women and girls get not only different meanings in gender, but also legislative change. If she had have made that argument as a liberal argument, I would have said, yeah, you go, girl. But she's completely denied the necessity for an active feminist movement. and she completely denies the ongoing oppression of women. I don't even know how she can do it. I don't know how she can utter the words.